there are so many severe weather events that are affecting, ranging from floods to hurricanes. And we also have slow onset events like sea level rise, desertification, and both are causing food and water shortages. And these have a direct impact on rights of people. And it's always the poor and the marginalized that are disproportionately affected by these consequences, whether it's poor countries in the world or poor people in rich countries as well. So it's a real injustice when we think about climate change. And COVID as well. We have seen that happening as well, the disproportionate impact on poor people and marginalized communities, minorities. There's a disproportionate impact on them, and they're least able to adapt to these consequences. As we know, 1.3 billion people currently live in multidimensional poverty, which means that it's not just about income we are talking about, but poor people have multiple other disadvantages. And climate change, like with COVID, will exacerbate poverty and other conditions of vulnerability. And the World Bank has estimated that climate change will push 120 million more people into poverty by 2030. And as we know, poverty is also a human rights issue because poor people cannot really enjoy their rights, or they are also at a greater risk of having their rights infringed. Like with climate change, poverty and environmental issues, like Hans mentioned just now, are also interrelated. Poor people tend to live in areas where the environment is degraded, or they are vulnerable to these environmental consequences, and environmental treaties and instruments have recognized this linkage, starting with our Common Future report. And as we saw with the consequences of climate change, there's a direct impact on human rights. So the enjoyment of many of the rights that are protected under international human rights law could be undermined because of the consequences of climate change. So climate change will exacerbate poverty. Both climate change and poverty have human rights implications. They're all interlinked. Morten, you asked me why a human rights approach is important. I think it gives a human face to the problem. We tend to talk about both climate change and poverty sort of at the macro level in abstract terms. But these are real people who are being affected by both these issues, right? So giving a human face to the problem is important. And it also gives victims a voice. We know that in many of these negotiations that take place at the international level, often these vulnerable groups are not heard. They are not given a voice. They are not represented. So by adopting a human rights approach, we can give them a voice, not just in relation to negotiations, but if they can get to the courts, they can seek a remedy. Of course, there are other jurisdictional and other hurdles to overcome, but the human rights framework provides them with a remedy. And also, the framework principles on human rights and environment have highlighted that states have additional obligations to ensure that the rights of vulnerable people are protected. So that in addition to the human rights obligations that states have in relation to everybody else, states will have additional obligations. To sort of sum up, poverty, human rights, and climate change are interlinked. Both are human rights, both climate change and poverty are human rights issues. They are global issues with localized consequences, and both can undermine people's ability to enjoy rights. And the other issue that I want to highlight is that these vulnerabilities intersect with one another. So it's important to recognize this intersectional nature of climate change, poverty, and human rights, and they have to be addressed together. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Sumuru. And I was just wondering, I mean, would you also see human rights and the SDG as sort of as an analytical tool to identify, in particular, when you have a suddenly occurring crisis, who are those groups that are left behind? Where is it that we should step in? Groups that may be overlooked today, that the human rights and the SDGs can sort of have played that role as well. Do you see that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the SDGs, you know, if you're a poor person, right? Many of the SDGs will be violated, like access to water, for example, gender equality, access to education. SDGs highlight the intersectional nature of these goals, and human rights provides us with a tool to bring to light the impact on vulnerable communities. And I mentioned the injustice of climate change earlier, and the justice framework, in addition to SDGs and human rights. I think the justice framework is a really good tool. Environmental justice is a really good tool to highlight the disproportionate impact on some of these communities. And the human rights gives them a tool to, you know, bring their issues to the table and things like that. So there are several sort of frameworks that we can use to highlight the disproportionate impact on some of these communities.